We have many teachers in this life. There are formal settings in which prepared lessons are taught, but there is also the kind of teaching that occurs within families, in which the lessons of heritage and faith solidify ethnic and religious identity. In the church, the ancient writings of the Bible and the traditions of the faith are passed on in the preaching and teaching and practice of the sacraments. This passing on of memories is an essential bridge between the past and the present. Like the other writers of the Gospels, Matthew aims to pass on the memory and lessons of Jesus and his followers to a later community. This task of passing on information inextricably involves teaching. Indeed, as Michael Brown demonstrates, Matthew's Jesus was clearly a teacher, and the importance of teaching as a distinctive mode of communication is favored by Matthew's presentation of the Messiah. And because the Gospel of Matthew ends with Jesus sending out his followers to teach all that he has taught them, the teachings of Jesus, therefore, have universal significance.
In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill." This statement, so characteristic of Matthew's gospel, is familiar to many of us. In truth, Matthew is so familiar to Christians that early on it was dubbed the church's gospel. It is a designation that is well deserved. Matthew's gospel serves as the framework for most of our reconstruction of the narrative about Jesus. Containing over 90% of the material found in Mark, Matthew is to many Christians the story of Jesus, with additions from Luke and maybe a bit of John. The star, the Magi, the little town of Bethlehem, the baptism in the Jordan, the Sermon on the Mount. These are but a few of the images of the gospel story that Matthew has shaped for us. And yet, if we dig deeper into this story of Jesus, so shaped by Matthew, we will find that Matthew has a singular perspective and presentation not found in Mark, Luke, or John. Matthew's distinctive fingerprint on the Jesus story can be found in at least 5 major themes that pervade his gospel. First, for Matthew, Jesus is a teacher. It is easy not to notice the degree to which Matthew emphasizes Jesus' teaching, but it is found throughout the gospel, even at the end. In chapter 28, for example, on a mountain in Galilee, Jesus tells his disciples to continue his mission. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age." Notice that the emphasis in the Great Commission is on teaching and not preaching. This is characteristic of Matthew. Even the Sermon on the Mount is a teaching moment more than it is a preaching event. Matthew presents a Jesus who is preeminently a teacher. Second, Matthew places less emphasis on miracles than do the other Gospels. Again, this is distinctive of Matthew's telling of the Jesus story. Compared to the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew places almost all the miracle stories in chapters 8 and 9 and shortens many of them. Matthew seems reluctant to endorse miracles and miracle workers outright. In fact, unlike the other Gospels, Matthew uses the miracle stories to introduce questions about the nature of discipleship. Following several brief accounts of Jesus' healing miracles, Matthew describes Jesus looking at the condition of the people with compassion. Then Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." This leads directly into the commissioning of his disciples in chapter 10. For Matthew, Jesus' miracles are not nearly as important as Jesus' mission. Third, Matthew has a strong Jewish orientation, stronger than that found in most of the other Gospels. Matthew makes it clear that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah sent by the Jewish God in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, who advocates adherence to the Jewish law. More than any other gospel, Matthew makes clear that the context for Jesus' ministry was Judaism. Fourth, Matthew places emphasis on what might be called superabundant righteousness. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Again, because Matthew is careful to place his story within the context of Judaism, he makes his points of comparison thoroughly Jewish. What is more, Matthew says that a disciple's righteousness, by which he means the words and deeds that proceed from faith, must be better, greater, more effective than those whom many would consider to be righteous. This is a radical understanding of discipleship. Contrary to what we might assume, Matthew does not say that the law is too difficult to fulfill. Rather, he says we can do even better than the law requires. Finally, embedded in Matthew's gospel is a constant tension between the universal and the particular. It is not always clear in a casual reading of the gospel how Matthew sees the relationship between the local mission of Jesus or the disciples and the universal mission that the gospel envisions in the Great Commission. According to Matthew, the gospel's universal mission is found and cultivated in our concern for those immediate issues in our particular contexts. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." The universal mission that Jesus calls his disciples to will be made known in something as particular as feeding the hungry. A word about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. As the inaugural teaching moment of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount contains the major themes illustrated throughout the rest of the gospel. Recall how many times I have cited it already. Although in continuity with Judaism, Matthew's conviction that the scriptures were fulfilled with Jesus motivated him to place Jesus rather than the Torah at the center of the disciple's life. According to Jesus' words in the sermon, the disciple looks to Jesus for a higher righteousness regarding the fulfillment of the law. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." The disciple looks to Jesus for a higher righteousness in piety and worship. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And what is interesting is how Matthew breaks the connection between this higher righteousness and the performance of miracles. "On that day," says Jesus, "many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name?' Jesus responds to them, 'I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers.'" The teaching of Matthew serves as a catechesis for the church on discipleship. More than any other gospel, Matthew uses the speeches of Jesus to speak to the church that grew out of the ministry of Jesus. In fact, it is the only gospel to use the word church at all. Matthew illustrates this higher righteousness in the parable on the Last Judgment. Looking again at the parable, notice how both the righteous and the unrighteous are surprised at their fates. The righteous ask, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you. The unrighteous do the same thing, trying to figure out when they fail to live up to the Lord's expectations. The teaching here is clear. A disciple who fulfills the higher righteousness expected in the church will do the work of the Lord out of her heart, not just because she knows that doing a particular deed will ingratiate her to the master. Of course, if the unrighteous had known that their acts were on behalf of the Lord, they would have fed the hungry, visited the sick, and clothed the naked, and so on. But that type of righteousness does not exceed that of others. Characteristic of this higher righteousness is that in fulfilling it, one acts on behalf of others without promise of reward. This is a radical teaching calling for radical discipleship.